Thief of Time, Part 17. Like shards of glass spinning through the air, fragments of history drifted and collided and intersected in the dark. There was a lighthouse, though. The valley of Oi Dong held on to the ever-repeating day. In the hall, almost all of the giant cylinders stood silent. All time ran out. Some had split, some had melted, some had exploded, some had simply vanished, but one still turned. Big Thunder, the oldest and biggest, ground slowly on its basalt bearing, winding time out at one end and back on the other, ensuring, as Wen had decreed, the perfect day would never end. Rambud Handysides was all alone in the hall, sitting beside the turning stone in the light of a butter lamp and occasionally throwing a handful of grease onto the base. A clink of stone made him peer into the darkness. It was heavy with the smoke of fried rock. The sound was again, and then the scratch and the flare of a match. "Lutze," he said, "is that you?" "I hope so, Rambud, but who knows these days?" Lutze stepped into the light and sat down. "Keeping you busy, are they?" Handysides sprang to his feet. "It's been terrible, Sweeper. Everyone is up in the Mandala Hall. It's worse than the Great Crash. There's bits of history everywhere, and we've lost half the spinners. We'll never be able to put it all... Now, you look like a man who's had a busy day," said Lutze kindly. "Not got a lot of sleep, eh? Tell you what, I'll take care of this. You go and get a bit of shut-eye, okay? We thought you were lost out in the world, and..." The monk burbled. "And now I'm back," smiled Lutze, patting him on the shoulder. "There's still that little alcove around the corner where you repair the smaller spinners, and there's still those unofficial bunks for when it's night shift and you only need a couple of lads to keep an eye on things." Handysides nodded and looked guilty. Lutze wasn't supposed to know about the bunks. "You get along then," said Lutze. He watched the man retreating back and added quietly, "And if you wake up you might turn out to be the luckiest idiot there ever was. Well, Wonder Boy, what next?" "We put everything back," said Lopsang, emerging from the shadows. "You know how long that took us last time?" "Yes," said Lopsang, looking around at the stricken hall and heading toward the podium. "I do. I don't think it will take me as long." "I wish you sounded more certain," said Susan. "I'm pretty certain," said Lopsang, running his fingers over the bobbins on the board. Lutze waved a cautionary hand at Susan. Lopsang's mind was already on the way somewhere else, and now she wondered how large a space it was occupying. His eyes were closed. "The spinners that are left, can you move the jumpers?" "I can show the ladies how to," said Lutze. "Are there not monks who know how to do this?" said Unity. "It would take too long. I am an apprentice to a sweeper. They would run around asking questions," said Lopsang. "You will not." "He's got a point right enough," said Lutze. "People will start saying, 'What is the meaning of this?' and bigot, and we'll never get anything done." Lopsang looked down at the bobbins and then across at Susan. "Imagine that there is a jigsaw, all in pieces. But I'm very good at spotting edges and shapes. Very good. And all the pieces are moving. But because they were once linked, they have, by their nature, a memory of that link. The shape is that memory. Once a few are in the right position, the rest will be easier. Oh, and imagine that all the bits are scattered across the whole eventuality and mixing randomly with pieces from other histories. Can you grasp all that?" "Yes, I think so." "Good. Everything I have just said is nonsense. It bears no resemblance to the truth of the matter in any way at all. But it is a lie that you can understand, I think. And then, afterward..." "You're going to go, aren't you?" said Susan. It was not a question. "I will not have enough power to stay," said Lopsang. "You need power to stay human," said Susan. She hadn't been aware of the rise of her heart, but now it was sinking. "Yes, even trying to think in a mere 4 dimensions is a terrible effort. I'm sorry. Even to hold onto my mind the concept of something called now is hard. You thought I was mostly human. I'm mostly not," he sighed. "If only I could tell you what everything looks like to me. It's so beautiful." Lopsang stared into the air above the little wooden bobbins. Things twinkled. There were complex curves and spirals, brilliant against the blackness. It was like looking at a clock in pieces, with every wheel and spring carefully laid out in the dark in front of him. Dismantled, controllable, every part of it understood, but a number of small but important things had gone ping into the corners of a very large room. If you were really good, then you could work out where they'd landed. "You've only got about a third of the spinners," came the voice of Lutze. "The rest are smashed." Lopsang couldn't see him. There was only the glittering show before his eyes. "That is true, but once they were whole," he said. He raised his hands and lowered them on the bobbins. Susan looked around at the sudden grinding noise and saw row after row of columns rising out of the dust and debris. They stood like lines of soldiers, dust cascading from them. "Good trick," Lutze shouted into Susan's ear about the thunder. "Feeding time into the spinners themselves. Theoretically possible, but we never managed to do it." "Do you know what he's actually going to do?" Susan shouted back. "Yeah, snatch the extra time out of bits of history that are too far ahead and shove it into the bits that have already fallen behind." "That sounds simple. Just one problem." "What?" "Can't do it. Losses." Lutze snapped his fingers, trying to explain time dynamics to a non-initiate. "Friction, divergence, all sort of stuff. You can't create time on the spinners. You can only move it around." There was a sudden bright blue glow around Lopsang. It flickered over the desk and then snapped across the air to form arcs of light leading to all the procrastinators. It crawled between the carved symbols and clung to them in a thickening layer like cotton winding on a reel. Lutze looked at the whirling light and the shadow within and almost lost against the glow. "At least," he added, "up until now." The spinners wound up to their working speed and then went faster under the lash of the light. It poured across the cavern in a solid, unending stream. Flames licked around the bottom of the nearest cylinder, the base glowing, and the noise from its stone bearing was joining a rising, cavern-filling scream of stone in distress. Lutze shook his head. "You, Susan, buckets of water from the wells. You, Miss Unity, you follow her with the grease pails." "And what are you going to do?" said Susan, grabbing 2 buckets. "I'm going to worry like hell, and that's not an easy job, believe me." The steam built up then, and there was the smell of burning butter. There was no time for anything but to run from the wells to the nearest spitting bearing and back. There was not enough time even for that. The spinners turned back and forth. There was no need for the jumpers now. The crystal rods that had survived the crash hung uselessly from their hooks as time arched overhead from one procrastinator to another, showing up as red or blue glow in the air. It was a sight to frighten the nuptas off of any trained spinner driver, Lutze knew. It looked like a cascade running wild, but there was some control in there, some huge pattern being woven. Bearings squealed, butter bubbled. The bases of some of the spinners were smoking, but things held. "They are being held," Lutze thought. He looked up at the registers. The boards slammed back and forth, sending lines of red or blue or bare wood across the wall of the cavern. There was a pall of white smoke around them, as their own wooden bearings gently charred. Past and future were streaming through the air. The sweeper could feel them. On the podium, Lopsang was wrapped in the glow. The bobbins were not being moved anymore. What was going on now was on some other level which didn't need the intervention of crude mechanisms. Lion tamer, Lutze thought. He starts off needing chairs and whips, but one day, if he's really good, he can go into the cage and do the show using nothing more than eye and voice. But only if he's really good. And you'll know if he's really good because, well, he'll come out of the cage again. He stopped his prowl along the thundering lines because there was a change in the sound. One of the biggest spinners was slowing down. It stopped as Lutze watched, and it didn't start again. Lutze raced around the cavern until he found Susan and Unity. 3 more spinners stopped before he reached him. He's doing it, come away, he shouted. With a jolt that shook the floor, another spinner stopped. The 3 ran toward the end of the cavern where the smaller procrastinators were still whirling, but the halt was already speeding down the rows. Spinner after spinner slammed to a standstill, the domino effect overtaking the humans until, when they reached the little chalk spinners, they was in time to see the last ones rattle gently to a standstill. There was silence, except for the sizzle of grease and the click of cooling rock. "Is it all over?" said Unity, wiping sweat from her face with her dress, leaving a trail of sequins. Lucy and Susan looked at the glow at the other end of the hall, and then at one another. "I don't think so," said Susan. Lucy nodded. "I think it's just—" he began. Bars of green light leaped from spinner to spinner and hung in the air as rigid as steel. They flickered on and off between the columns, filling the air with thunderclaps. Patterns of switching snapped back and forth across the cavern. The tempo increased. The thunderclaps became one long roll of overpowering sound. The bars brightened, expanded, and then the air was all one brilliant light, which then vanished. The sound ceased just as abruptly that the silence clanged. The trio got to their feet slowly. "What was that?" said Unity. "I think he made some changes," said Lucy. The spinners were silent. The air was hot. Smoke and steam filled the roof of the cavern. Then, responding to the routine of humanity's eternal wrestle with time, the spinners began to pick up the load. It came gently like a breeze, and the spinners took the strain, from the smallest to the largest, settling once again into that gentle, ponderous pirouette. "Perfect," said Lucy. "Almost as good as it was, I bet." "Only almost," said Susan, wiping the butter off her face. "Well, he's only partly human," said the sweeper. They turned to the podium, and it was empty. Susan was not surprised. He'd be weak now, of course. Of course, something like this would take it out of anyone. Of course, he'd need to rest. Of course. "He's gone," she said flatly. "Who knows," said Lucy, "for is it not written, you never know what's going to turn up." The reassuring rumble of the procrastinators now filled the cave. Lucy could feel the time flows in the air. It was invigorating, like the smell of the sea. "I ought to spend more time down here," he thought. "It broke history and repaired it," said Susan. "Cause and cure. That makes no sense." "Not in 4 dimensions," said Unity. "In 18, it's all perfectly clear." "And now may I suggest you ladies leave by the back way," said Lucy. "People are going to come running down here in a minute, and it's all going to be very excitable. Probably best if you aren't around." "What will you do?" said Susan. "Lie," said Lucy happily. "It's amazing how often that works." Tick! Susan and Unity stepped out of a door in the rock and took the path that led through rhododendron groves out of the valley. The sun was touching the horizon and the air was warm, although there were snowfields quite close by. At the tip of the valley, the water from the stream plunged over a cliff in a fall so long that it landed as a sort of rain. Susan pulled herself onto a rock and settled down to wait. "It's a long way to Ankh-Morpork," said Unity. "Yeah, we'll have a lift," said Susan. The first stars were already coming out. "The stars are very pretty," said Unity. "Do you really think so?" "I'm learning to. Humans believe they are. And the thing is, there's times when you look at the universe and you think, what about me? And you can just hear the universe replying, well, what about you?" Unity appeared to consider this. "Well, what about you?" she said. Susan sighed. "Exactly." She sighed again. "You can't think about just one person while you're saving the world. You have to be a cold, calculating bastard." "That sounded as if you were quoting somebody," said Unity. "Who said that?" "Some total idiot," said Susan. She tried to think of other things and added, "We didn't get all of them. There are still auditors down there somewhere." "That will not matter," said Unity calmly. "Look at the sun." "Well, it is setting." "And? That means the time is flowing through the world. The body exacts its toll, Susan. Soon my former colleagues, bewildered and fleeing, will become tired. They will have to sleep. I follow you so far, but I'm insane. I know this, but the first time it happened to me, I found such horror that I cannot express it. Can you imagine what it's like? For an intellect 1 billion years old, in a body which is an ape on the back of a rat that grew out of a lizard. Can you imagine what comes out of the dark places uncontrolled? What are you telling me? They will die in their dreams. Susan thought about this. Millions and millions of years of thinking precise, logical thoughts. And then humanity's murky past drops all its terrors on you in one go. She could almost feel sorry for them. Almost. "But you didn't," she said. "No, I think I must be different. It's a terrible thing to be different, Susan. Did you have romantic hopes in connecting with the boy?" The questions came out of nowhere, and there was no defense. Unity's face showed nothing but a kind of nervous concern. "No," said Susan. Unfortunately, Unity did not seem to have mastered some of the subtleties of human conversation, such as when the tone of voice means, "Stop this line of inquiry right now or may huge rats eat you by day and by night." "I confess strange feelings regarding his self that was the clockmaker," said Unity. "Sometimes when he smiled he was normal. I wanted to help him because he seemed so closed in and sad." "You don't have to confess things like that," Susan snapped. "How do you even know the word romantic anyway?" she added. "I found some books of poetry." Unity actually looked embarrassed. "Really? I never trusted it," said Susan. "Huge, giant, hungry rats. I found it most curious. How can words on a page have power like that? There's no doubt that being human is incredibly difficult and cannot be mastered in one lifetime," said Unity sadly. Susan felt a slap of guilt. It wasn't Unity's fault after all. People learn things when they grow up, things that never get written down. And Unity, well, she had never grown up. "What are you going to do now?" she said. "I do not know." "Well, if I can help in any way." It was, she realized later, one of those phrases like, "How are you?" People were supposed to understand that it wasn't a real question, but Unity had not learned that either. "Thank you. You can indeed help. I wish to do something human." Fine if I wish to die." And galloping out of the sunset, some riders were approaching. Tick! Small fires burned in the rubble, brightening the night. Most of the house had been completely destroyed, although Soto considered the word shredded was perhaps more accurate. He was sitting by the side of the street watching carefully, with his begging bowl in front of him. There were, of course, far more interesting and complex ways for a history monk to avoid being noticed, but he adopted the begging bowl method ever since Lutze had shown him that people never see anyone who wants them to give him money. He'd watched the rescuers drag the bodies out of the house. Initially, they thought that one of them had been hideously mutilated in the explosion, until it sat up and explained that it was an Igor, and in very good shape for an Igor, thank you very much. The other he recognized as Dr. Hopkins of the Guild of Clockmakers, who was miraculously unharmed. Soto did not believe in miracles, however. He was also suspicious about the fact that the ruined house was full of oranges, that Dr. Hopkins was babbling about getting sunlight out of them, and that his sparkling little abacus was telling him that something enormous had happened. He decided to make a report and see what the boys at Oi Dong said. Soto picked up the bowl and set off through the network of alleys back to his base. He didn't bother much about concealment now. Lutze's time in the city had been a process of accelerated education for many citizens of the lurking variety. The people of Ankh-Morpork knew all about Rule 1. At least, they had known up until now. 3 figures lurched out of the dark, and one of them swung a length of wood that would have connected with Soto's head if he hadn't ducked. He was used to this sort of thing, of course. There was always the occasional slow learner, but they presented no peril that a neat slice couldn't handle. He straightened up, ready to ease his way out of there, and a thick lock of black hair fell onto his shoulder, slithered down his robe, and flopped onto the ground. It made barely a sound, but the expression on his face as Soto looked down and then up at his attackers made them draw back. He could see through the blood-red rage that they all wore stained grey clothes and looked even crazier than the usual alley people. They looked like accountants going mad. One of them reached out toward the begging bowl. Everyone has the conditional clause in their life, some little unspoken addition to the rules, like except when I really need to, or unless no one is looking, or indeed unless the first one was Nuka. Soto had for centuries embraced a belief in the sanctity of all life and the ultimate uselessness of violence, but his personal conditional clause was, but not the hair. No one touches the hair, okay? Even so, everyone ought to have a chance. The attackers recoiled as he threw the bowl against the wall, where the hidden blades buried themselves in the woodwork. Then it began to tick. Soto ran back down the alley, skidded around the corner, then shouted, "Duck!" Unfortunately for the auditors, alas, he was just a tiny, tiny fraction of a second too late. Tick! Lutze was in his garden of 5 surprises when the air sparkled and fragmented and swirled into a shape in front of him. He looked up from his ministrations to the yodeling stick insect who had been off its food. Lopsang stood on the path. The boy was wearing a black robe dotted with stars, which blew and rattled its rags around him on this windless morning, as if he was standing in the center of a gale, which Lucy supposed he kind of was. "Back again, wonder boy," said the sweeper. "In a way I never leave," said Lopsang. "Things have gone well with you?" "Don't you know? I could, but part of me has to do this the traditional way. Well, the abbot is mighty suspicious, and there's some amazing rumors flying around the place. I didn't say much. What do I know of anything? I'm just a sweeper." With that, Lutze turned his attention to the sick stick insect. He counted to 4 under his breath before Lopsang said, "Please, I have to know. I believe that the 5th surprise is you. Am I right?" Lutze cocked his head. An old noise that he had heard for so long that he never consciously heard it any more had changed its tone. "The spinners are all winding out," he said. "They know you're here, lad. I shall not be here long, sweeper. Please, you just want to know my little surprise." "Yes, I know nearly everything else," said Lopsang. "But you are time. What I tell you in the future you'll know now, right? But I'm partly human. I want to stay partly human. That means doing things the right way around. Please?" Lutze sighed and looked for a while down the avenue of cherry blossom. "When the pupil can beat the master, there's nothing the master cannot tell him. Remember?" "Yes." "Very well. The Iron Dojo should be free." Lopsang looked surprised. "The Iron Dojo, isn't that the one with the sharp spikes in the wall? And the ceiling, yes. That's the one that's like being inside a giant porcupine turned inside out." Lopsang looked horrified. "But that's not for practice. The rules say..." "That's the one," said Lutze, "and I say we use it." "Oh. Good, no argument," said Lutze. "This way, lad." Blossom cascaded from the trees as they passed. They entered the monastery and took the same route they'd taken once before. This brought them into the hall of the mandala, and the sand rose like a dog welcoming its master spiraled in the air below Lopsang's sandals. Lutze heard the shouts of the attendants behind him. News like this spread throughout the valley like ink in water. Hundreds of monks, apprentices, and sweepers were trailing the pair as they crossed the inner courtyards like the tail of a comet. Above them, all the time, petals of cherry blossoms fell like snow. At last Lutze reached the high, round metal door of the Iron Dojo. The clasp of the door was 15 feet up. No one who did not belong there was supposed to open the door of the dojo. The sweeper nodded at his former apprentice. "You do it," he said. "I can't." Lopsang glanced at him and then looked up at the high clasp. Then he pressed a hand against the iron. Rust spread around his fingers. Red stains spread out across the ancient metal. The door began to creak and then to crumble. Lutze prodded it with an experimental finger, and a slab of cookie dough strong metal fell out and collapsed on the flagstone. "Very impressed," he began. A squeaky rubber elephant bounced off his head. "Pick it!" The crowd parted. The chief acolyte ran forward, carrying the abbot. "Where is the wanna picket meaning of this? Who is the was a funny man this person, sweeper? The spinners are dancing in the hall." Lutze bowed. "It is time, Reverend One, as you have suspected," he said. Still bent in the bow, he looked up and sideways at Lopsang. "Bow," he hissed. Lopsang looked puzzled. "I should bow even now?" "Bow, you little stonker, or I shall teach you such discipline. Show deserved respect. You are still my apprentice until I give you leave." Shocked, Lopsang bowed. "And why do you visit us in our timeless valley?" said the abbot. "Tell the abbot," said Lutze. I wish to learn the 5th surprise," said Lopsang. "Reverend One?" Lutze supplied. "Reverend One," Lopsang finished. "You visit us just to learn of our clever sweeper's fancies," said the abbot. "Yes, Reverend One. Of all the things time could be doing, and you wish to see an old man's trick? Bicket?" "Yes, Reverend One." The monks stared at Lopsang. His robe still fluttered this way and that in the teeth of the intangible gale, the stars glinting when they caught the light. The abbot smiled a cherubic smile. "So should we all," he said. "None of us have ever seen it, I believe. None of us have ever been able to wheedle it out of him. But this is the Iron Dojo. It has rules. 2 may walk in, but only 1 can walk out. This is no practice dojo. One elephant! Do you understand?" "What? I didn't know." Lobsang began, but the sweeper jerked an elbow into his ribs. "You say yes, Reverend One," he growled, "but I never intended—" This time the back of his head was slapped. "This is no time to step back," Lutze said. "You're too late, Wonder Boy." He nodded to the abbot. "My apprentice understands, Reverend One." "Your apprentice, sweeper." "Oh yes, Reverend One," said Lutze. "My apprentice, until I say otherwise." "Really, Bicket? Then he may enter. You too, Lutze." "But I only meant to—" Lobsang protested. "Inside," Lutze roared. "Will you shame me? Shall people think I have taught you nothing?" The inside of the iron dojo was indeed a darkened dome full of spikes. They were needle-thin, and there were tens of thousands of them covering the nightmare walls. "Who would build something like this?" said Lobsang, looking up at the glistening points that covered even the ceiling. "It teaches the virtues of stealth and discipline," said Lutze, cracking his knuckles. "Impetuosity and speed can be as dangerous to the attacker as to the attacked, so perhaps you will learn. One condition: we are all human here. Agreed?" "Of course, sweeper, we are all human here." "And shall we agree? No tricks." "No tricks," said Lobsang. "But are we fighting or are we talking?" "But look, if only one can walk out, that means I'll have to kill you," said Lobsang. "Or vice versa, of course," said Lutze. "That is the rule, yes. Shall we get on?" "But I didn't know that." "In a life, as in breakfast cereal, it is always best to read the instructions on the box," said Lutze. "This is the Iron Dojo, Wonder Boy." He stepped back and bowed. Lobsang shrugged and bowed in return. Lutze took a few steps back. He closed his eyes for a moment, then went through a series of simple moves, limbering up. Lobsang winced to hear the crackle of joints. Around Lobsang there was a series of snapping noises, and for a moment he thought of the old sweeper's bones. But tiny hatches all over the curved wall were swinging open. He could hear whispers as people jostled for position, and by the sound of it there were a great many people. He extended his hands and let himself rise gently in the air. "I thought we said no tricks," said Lutze. "Yes, sweeper," said Lobsang, poised in midair. "And then I thought, never forget Rule 1. "Aha! Well done, you have learned something." Lobsang drifted closer. "You cannot believe the things that I have seen since last I saw you," he said. "Words cannot describe them. I have seen worlds nesting within worlds, like those dolls they carve in Uberwald. I have heard the music of the years. I know more than I can ever understand, but I do not know the fifth surprise. It is a trick, a conundrum, a test." "Everything's a test," said Lutze. "Then show me the fifth surprise, and I promise not to harm you." "You promise not to harm me." "I promise not to harm you," Lobsang repeated solemnly. "Fine, you only had to ask," said Lutze, smiling broadly. "What? I asked before and you refused." "You only had to ask at the right time, Wonder Boy." "And how is it the right time?" "It is written, 'There is no time like the present,'" said Lutze. "Behold, the fifth surprise." He reached into his robe. Lobsang floated closer. The sweeper produced a cheap carnival mask. It was one of those that consisted of a fake pair of glasses glued above a big pink nose and a heavy black mustache. He put it on and wiggled his ears once or twice. "Boo!" he said. "What?" said Lobsang, bewildered. "Boo," Lutze repeated. "I never said it was a particularly imaginative surprise, did I?" He wiggled his ears again and then wiggled his eyebrows. "Good aim," he said and grinned. Lobsang laughed. Lutze grinned wider. Lobsang laughed louder and lowered himself to the mat. The blows came out of nowhere. They caught him in the stomach, on the back of his neck, in the small of his back, and swept his legs from under him. He landed on his stomach, with Lutze pinning him down the straddle of the fish. The only way to get out of that was to dislocate your own shoulders. There was a sort of collective sigh from the hidden watchers. "Déjà vu." "What?" said Lobsang into the map. "You said none of the monks knew déjà vu." "I never taught it to them, that's why," said Lutze. "Promise me not to harm me, would you?" "Thank you so very much." "Submit." "You never told me you knew it." Lutze's knees rammed into the secret pressure points, were turning Lobsang's arms into powerless lumps of flesh. "I may be old, but I'm not daft," Lutze shouted. "You don't think I'd give away a trick like that, do you?" "That's not fair." Lutze leaned down until his mouth was an inch from Lobsang's ear. "Didn't say fair on the box, lad. But you can win, you know. You could turn me into dust just like that. How could I stop time?" I can't do that. You mean you won't, and we both know it. Submit? Lobsang could feel parts of his body trying to shut themselves down. His shoulders were on fire. I can discarnate, he thought. Yes, I can. I could turn him to dust with a thought and lose. I'd walk out and he'd be dead and I'd have lost. Nothing to worry about, said Lutze calmly. You forgot about Rule 19. Submit. Rule 19, said Lobsang, almost pushing himself off the mat until terrible pain forced him down again. What the hell is Rule 19? Yes, submit. Remember never to forget Rule 1, said Lutze. He released his grip. And always ask yourself, how come it was created in the first place, eh? Lutze got to his feet and went on. But you have performed well, all things considered, and therefore as your master I have no hesitation in recommending you for the yellow robe. Besides, he lowered his voice to a whisper, everyone peeking in here has seen me beat time, and that's the sort of thing that'll look really good on my resume, if you catch my meaning. Definitely give the old Rule 1 a fillip. Let me give you a hand up. He reached down. Lobsang was about to take the hand when he hesitated. Lutze grinned again and gently pulled him upright. But only one of us can leave, Sweeper, said Lobsang, rubbing his shoulders. Really, said Lutze, but playing the game changes the rules. I say the hell with it. The remains of the dojo were pushed aside by the hands of many monks. There was the sound of someone being hit with a rubber yak. Bigot! And the abbot, I believe, is ready to present you with the robe, said Lutze. Don't make any comment if he dribbles on it, please. They left the dojo and, followed now by every single soul in Oi Dong, headed for the long terrace. It was, Lutze reminisced later on, an unusual ceremony. The abbot did not appear overawed, because babies generally aren't and will throw up over anyone. Besides, Lobsang might have been a master of the gulfs of time, but the abbot was the master of the valley, and therefore respect was a line that travelled in both directions. But the handing over of the robe had caused a difficult moment. Lobsang had refused it. It had been left to the chief acolyte to ask why, while the whispered currents of surprise washed through the crowd. I'm not worthy, sir. Lutze has declared that you have completed your apprenticeship, my Lobsang Lod. Lobsang bowed. Then I will take the broom and the robe of a sweeper, sir. This time the current was a tsunami. It crashed over the audience, heads turned, there were gasps of shock and one or two nervous laughs. And, from lines of sweepers who had been allowed to pause in their task to watch the event, there was a watchful, intent silence. The chief acolyte licked his suddenly dehydrated lips. But, you are the incarnation of time. In this valley, sir, said Lobsang firmly, I am as worthy as a sweeper. The chief acolyte looked around, but there was no help anywhere. The other senior members of the monastery had no wish to share in the huge pink cloud of embarrassment. The abbot merely blew bubbles and grinned the inward knowing grin of all babies everywhere. Do we have any, do we present sweepers with, do we by any chance? The acolyte mumbled. Lutze stepped up behind him. Can I be of any help, your acolytity? He said, with a sort of mad, keen subservience that was quite alien to his normal attitude. Lutze, yes, I could fetch a nearly new robe, sir, and the lad can have my old broom if you'll sign a chitty for me to get a new one from the store, sir, said Lutze, sweating helpfulness from every pore. The chief acolyte, drowning well out of his depth, seized on this like a passing lifebelt. Oh, would you be so good, Lutze? It's so kind of you. Lutze vanished in a blur of helpful speed that once again quite surprised those who thought they knew him. He reappeared with his broom and a robe made white and thin with frequent bashings on the stones by the river. He solemnly handed them over to the chief acolyte. Thank you, Is there a special ceremony for the man burbled. Very simple one, sir, said Lutze, still radiating eagerness. Wording is quite loose, sir, but generally we say, this is your robe. Look after it. It belongs to the monastery. Sir. And then with the broom we say something like, here's your broom, treat it well, it is your friend. You will be fined if you lose it. Remember they do not grow on trees, sir. The chief acolyte murmured. And does the abbot... Oh no, the abbot would not make a presentation to a sweeper, said Lobsang quickly. Lutze, it is generally done by a senior sweeper, your acolytity. Oh, and by some happy chance do you happen to be... Lutze bobbed a bow. Oh, yes, sir. To the chief acolyte still floundering in the flood of the turning tide, this was as welcome as the imminent prospect of dry land. He beamed maniacally. I wonder then, if you would be so kind to, Happy to, sir. Lutze swung around. Right now, sir? Oh, yes, please. Right you are. Step forward, Lopsang Lod. Yes, sweeper. Lutze held out the worn robe and the elderly broom. Broom, robe, do not lose them. We are not made of money, he announced. I thank you for them, said Lopsang. I am honored. Lopsang bowed. Lutze bowed. With their heads close together and at the same height, Lutze hissed, Very surprising. Thank you. Nicely mythic, the whole thing. Definitely one for the scrolls, but bordering on smug. Do not try it again. Right. They both stood up. And, what happens now? Said the chief acolyte. He was a broken man, and he knew it. Nothing was going to be the same after this. Nothing, really, said Lutze. Sweepers get on with sweeping. You take that side, lad, and I'll take this. But he's time, said the chief acolyte. The son of when? There's so much we have to ask. There's so much I will not tell, said Lopsang, smiling. The abbot leaned forward and dribbled in the chief acolyte's ear. The chief acolyte finally gave up. Of course it's not up to us to question you, he said, backing away. No, said Lopsang, it is not. I suggest you all get on with your very important work, because this plaza is going to need all of my attention. There were frantic hand signals among the senior monks, and gradually and reluctantly the monastery staff moved away. They'll be watching us from every place they can hide, mumbled Lutze when the sweepers were alone. Oh yes, said Lopsang. So, how are you then? Very well, and my mother is happy. She will retire with my father. What, a cottage in the country, that sort of thing? Not quite, but similar, though. There was no sound for a while but the brushing of two brooms. Then Lopsang said, I'm aware, Lutze, that it is usual for an apprentice to give a small gift or token to his master when he finishes his apprenticeship. Possibly, said Lutze, straightening up, but I don't need anything. I got my mat, my bowl, and my way. Every man has something he desires, said Lopsang. Got you there then, Wonder Boy. I'm 800 years old. I've run through all my desires a long time ago. Oh, that's a shame. I hoped I could find something. Now Lopsang straightened up and swung his broom onto his shoulder. In any case, I must leave, he said. There's so much still to do. I'm sure there is, said Lutze. There's a whole stretch under the trees, for one thing, and while we're on the subject, Wonder Boy, did you let that witch have her broomstick back? Lopsang nodded. Let us just say I put things back. It's a lot newer than it was, too. Ha, said Lutze, sweeping up a few more petals. Just like that, just like that. So easily does a thief of time repay his debts. Lopsang must have caught the rebuke in the tone. He stared down at his feet. Well, perhaps not all of them, I admit, he said. Oh, said Lutze, still apparently fascinated by the end of his own broom. But when you have to save the world, you cannot think of one person, you see, because one person is a part of that world, Lopsang went on. Really, said the sweeper, you think so? You've been talking to some very strange people, my lad. But now I have time, said Lopsang earnestly, and I hope she'll understand. It's amazing what a lady will understand if you find the right way of putting it, said Lutze. Best of luck, lad. You didn't do so bad on the whole, and is it not written, it's never too late. Lopsang smiled at him and vanished. Lutze went back to sweeping. After a while he grinned at the memory. An apprentice gives a gift to a master, eh? As if Lutze could ever want anything that time could give him. And then he stopped, and looked up, and laughed out loud. Overhead, swelling as he watched, the cherries were ripening. Tick. In some place that had not existed before, and only existed now for this very purpose, there stood a large gleaming vat. 10,000 gallons of delicate fondant sugar cream, infused with essence of violets and stirred into dark chocolate, said Chaos. There's also strata of hazelnut praline and rich buttercream and areas of soft caramel for that especial touch of delight. So you're saying that this vat could exist somewhere in a truly infinite everywhere, and therefore it can exist here, said Death. Indeed, said Chaos. But it no longer exists in the place where it should exist. No, it should now exist here. The math is quite easy, said Chaos. Ah, well, math, said Death dismissively. Generally, I never get much further than subtraction. In any case, chocolate is hardly a rare commodity, said Chaos. There are planets covered in the stuff. Really? Indeed. It might be best, said Death, if news like that did not get about. He walked back to where Unity was waiting in the darkness. You do not need to do this, he said. What else is there, said Unity. I've betrayed my own kind, and I'm hideously insane. I can never be at home anywhere, and staying here would be an agony. She stared into the chocolate abyss. A dusting of sugar sparkled on its surface. Then she slipped out of her dress. To her amazement, she felt embarrassed about doing so, but still drew herself up haughtily. Spoon, she commanded, and held out her right hand imperiously. Chaos gave a silver ladle a final theatrical polish and passed it to her. Goodbye, said Unity. Do pass on my best wishes to your granddaughter. She walked a few steps back, turned, and broke into a run, and took off into a perfect swallow dive. The chocolate closed over her with barely a sound. Then the two watchers waited until the fat, lazy ripple had died away. Now there was a lady with style, said Chaos. What a waste. Yes, I thought so. Well, it's been fun up to that point anyway, and now I must be off, said Chaos. You're continuing with the milk round. Well, people rely on me. Death looked impressed. It's going to be interesting to have you back. Yes, it is, said Chaos. You're not coming. I'm just going to wait here for a while. Why? Just in case. Ah. Yes. It was some minutes later that Death reached into his robe and pulled out a lifetimer that was small and light enough to have been designed for a doll. He turned around. But I died, said the Shade of Unity. Yes, said Death. This is the next part. Tick. Emma Robertson sat in the classroom with a wrinkled brow chewing on her pencil. Then, rather slowly, but with the air of one imparting great secrets, she set to work. She wrote, We went to Lanka where there are witches. They are kind, they grow herbs. We met this witch. She was very droll and sang us a snog about a hedgehog. It had difficult words. Jason tried to kick her cat. It chased him up a tree. I know a lot about witches. Now they do not have warts. They do not eat you. They are just like your gran, except your gran does not know default words. At her high desk, Susan relaxed. There was nothing like a classroom of bent heads. A good teacher used whatever materials there were to hand, and taking the class to visit Mrs. Ogg was an education in itself. 2 educations. A classroom going well had its own smell, a hint of pencil shavings, poster paints, long dead stick insects, glue, and of course the faint aroma of Billy. There had been an uneasy meeting with her grandfather. She'd raged that he hadn't told her things, and he said, of course he hadn't. If you told humans what the future held, then it wouldn't. That made sense. Of course it made sense. It was good logic. The trouble was, Susan was only mostly logical. And so now things were back in that uneasy, rather cool state where they spent most of their time in the tiny little family that ran on dysfunctionality. Maybe, she thought, that was a normal family state in any case. When push came to shove, thank you, Mrs. Ogg, she'd always remember that phrase now. They'd rely on each other automatically, without a thought. Apart from that, they kept out of one another's way. She hadn't seen the death of rats lately. It was too much to hope that he was dead. In any case, it hadn't slowed him down so far. That thought made her think about the contents of her desk. Susan was very strict about eating in the class, and took the view that if there were rules, then they applied to everyone, even her. Otherwise, they were merely tyranny. But rules were to make you think before you broke them. There was still half a box of Hicks and Meeking's cheapest assortment tucked in there among the books and papers. Opening the lid carefully and slipping her hand in was easy, and so was the maintenance of a suitably teachery face while she did so. Questing fingers found a chocolate in the nest of empty paper cups. Then she briskly picked up the keys and walked to the classroom cupboard with what she hoped was a purple step of someone about to check on the supply of pencils. After all, you never knew with pencils. They needed watching. The door clicked behind her, leaving only the dim light through the transom. She put the chocolate in her mouth and shut her eyes. She was mostly human and only partly immortal. It was a difficult trick. It had to do with how you reacted to the universe and how the universe reacted to you. In a way, it was all smoke and mirrors, or maybe it was really just a matter of assumption. It certainly wasn't a matter of logic. She had certain powers and advantages, and she would be immortal for as long as she lived. The chocolate outer shell dissolved, and her very human senses told her that she had selected a nougat. But she was resolute. Life was tough. Sometimes you got nougat. You just had to bite it. A faint, cardboardy sound made her open her eyes. The lids were lifting on the boxes of stars she kept for the children, and the scraps of gold and silver paper were spilling out. They twirled, they moved around her in wheels and spirals. They whirled up into the shadows of a cupboard and hung there, brilliant and beautiful against the darkness, a whole universe in miniature. Susan watched them for a while and then said, "All right, you have my full attention, whoever you are." At least that was what she meant to say. The peculiar stickiness of the nougat caused it to come out as, "All right, you got my full attention. Oh, damn." The stars around her head grew brighter, and the cupboard's interior darkened into interstellar black. "It is you, Qa'Rajh," she began. "It is me," said Lopsang. "Tick, even with nougat, you can have a perfect moment."